Hi, welcome to what we are calling Classic Bookmark. When we started shooting these interviews in the spring of 1988, we had no idea the show would go on for 30 years, with over 400 episodes. To celebrate and mark this achievement, we have selected 15 shows. Choosing was difficult. Most of the writers chosen, like Horton Foote and Ray Bradbury, are deceased. Others, like Toni Morrison, the Nobel Prize winner, are perfectly well, but I do not think we will be lucky enough to have them on the show again. We purposely did not include some bookmark favorites like Rick Bragg, Winston Groom, Sina Jeter Naslund, Brad Watson, Daniel Wallace, Michelle Richmond, and others, since we plan to visit with them regularly in the future. Viewers will notice that the technology has improved considerably in 30 years. We've cleaned these up the best we could. These first 30 years have been a lot of fun. I hope you enjoy watching these as much as I did making them. Alexander McCall Smith has brought pleasure to over 4 million readers in 36 languages with his #1 Ladies Detective Agency mysteries set in Botswana, his 44 Scotland Street series set in Edinburgh, his children's books, and many other volumes. I spoke with Alexander McCall Smith at the Winfrey Hotel in Hoover, Alabama. Well, thank you for coming in. Even more than most guests, I know that you are on a very tight schedule, moving from place to place. Yesterday, you were speaking and signing books where?
I was in New York yesterday.
And where will you be tomorrow?
I think I will be in Cedar Rapids.
So
I get mixed up.
It really is. It's one day, one city.
It is. This tour is 12 cities in 2 weeks, which of course has all sorts of logistic problems. How do you get your shirts laundered when you're not in a hotel long enough to do that? So the publishers buy me shirts en route.
Really? How nice.
Yeah, very good of them, yeah.
Well, it's gracious of you to take time out of what is really a supernaturally busy schedule. Our viewers, even viewers who have read some of your fictions, may not know a lot about you. You were born in what used to be called Southern Rhodesia.
That's
Is
right.
that right?
That's
Why?
right.
Why were you born there?
Well, my parents were there. My father went there in the 1930s, and so we lived there, and I spent my childhood there. And then the whole family eventually left, and I went back to Scotland, and I spent most of my life in Scotland, with the exception of the occasional period abroad. I've lived in Botswana, I've lived in Swaziland, and I've spent 2 periods of 6 months as a visiting professor in Dallas, Texas. So I've stayed in various places.
How old were you when you left what became Zimbabwe and went to Scotland to live?
18. So I spent my whole childhood in Africa, which obviously was a very important period for me and has, I think, been reflected in my writing later on.
And although many of your readers won't necessarily know this, you are a professor of law.
Well, I was a professor of law. I've become an emeritus professor.
Yeah.
When the books took off, I had a long-term unpaid leave of absence from the University of Edinburgh where I worked, and then I realized that I wasn't going to be going back, so I decided to leave altogether, and they made me a professor emeritus, which is rather a nice thing which involves no duties. In fact, doesn't involve anything as far as I can make out.
Doesn't involve much pay either, though, does it?
No pay at all. In fact, they expect you to give to the university, so it's very convenient.
During the time that when you were a practicing professor of law, you were writing all the while. You were writing what we might loosely call academic work, and you were writing children's books. How many children's books did you write?
I wrote over 30 children's books. And I started doing that by accident. There was a Scottish publishing firm that had a competition for manuscripts by Scottish writers, and I submitted 2. One was a novel and another was a children's book. And I was hoping that I'd win the novel category, but I didn't. But I was lucky enough to be one of the winners of the children's books category. And so I found myself writing children's books, which was a rather curious thing to do, and I did that in my spare time. And I wrote, as I say, quite a number of them, and rather enjoyed it. But eventually I decided that I'd done enough, and I stopped in the middle of a children's book, and these children's books are now being republished. And I'll do occasional children's books.
You didn't do illustration, though?
No.
And am I right, you have 3 children, is that right? Two. They must be getting up.
Well, yes, I've got two daughters who are 21 and 19, both of them medical students, and that's us. My wife is a doctor herself. She's a general practitioner, GP, in Edinburgh, where we live.
There was a moment when everything changed, when you, well, to prepare ourselves for that, you went to Botswana to help set up the legal code. Is that about right?
Well, it's almost right. I did go to Botswana. I went to set up, or help them set up, a law school there back in 1981. I'd spent 1980 in Swaziland, which is also in that region, that part of southern Africa. And then 1981 I was in Botswana, and I lived there for that period. And I discovered that I really liked the country. I'd visited it very briefly before, but I really, really enjoyed being there and was very intrigued by it, because it's a remarkable country. It's the most successful country in Africa, really. Very, very successful, very, very well run since independence in 1966. It's been consistently democratic. They've had no political prisoners, and they've really run the economy very well. They've been lucky. They found diamonds shortly after independence, which helps. If you find diamonds, that generally helps the exchequer. And so they've brick by brick built up a very fine country. And they're very appealing people. And so I thought that I would continue to have some sort of association with the country. And I went back every year and still do. But I never thought that I'd spend quite so much of my time writing about the place.
There is, in interviews and in other printed materials about you, there seems to be a moment, an image, where you saw the woman in the yard.
Yes.
Which is that actually the genesis for the first ladies' detective?
Yes, it is actually. It was. I was visiting friends of mine who lived in a place called Machudi, which is a small village or small town north of the capital, Gaborone. And a lady in the village, a Motswana lady in the village, was going to give them a chicken for lunch the following day. And so we went down. I went down with my hostess to collect the chicken, and we found this woman who lived in a small house, very modest house, but with a beautifully kept yard around it, nicely kept yard. And there was a chicken walking about the yard, and the chicken was in blissful ignorance of what lay ahead of it. And she chased this chicken round the yard with a great kerfuffle and clouds of dust and feathers, and the odds were distinctly against the chicken, and she eventually fell on it and wrung its neck and handed it over to us. And I thought, what a remarkable woman. And I found myself thinking about her life and what her life would have been like. Mm-hmm. She would have raised children in possibly rather difficult circumstances, probably not with a great deal of money. And she kept this very tight ship, this very nicely swept yard and nice neat house. And I thought maybe one day I'd write a story about somebody like that. And that idea bubbled away in my subconscious mind over the years. And many years later, I sat down, and this woman called Precious Ramotswe, a fictional name, came to my mind. Mm-hmm. And I wrote a short story about her and how she inherits cattle from her father and sets up a little business which she decides is a detective agency, and she has no experience. And that was the birth of the #1 ladies detective agency, and I had no idea it would change my life entirely.
Well, it sort of has.
It has.
Are there now 6 or 7? 6?
There are 7 in print, and I've just finished writing volume 8, and I've agreed to write 11 altogether. So.
Oh, have you? The last time I read anything about that, you had agreed to stop at 8.
Yes. Well, then we agreed to carry on.
All right.
So Maramotswe continues.
And at one point, it had been translated into 29 languages?
It's 36 now.
36 now.
Languages. So Maramotswe is read about in all sorts of corners of the world. She was very popular in Iceland, for example, which is about as far away as one can get from Botswana.
These novels, charming. There's no overt sexuality in these novels. There is misbehavior,
yes,
bad straying husbands and what have you.
Yes.
But there's no overt sexuality,
yes,
and very little violence on stage.
Yes.
And yet they have been fantastically successful.
Yes.
And I know that you have thought about this, and
yeah.
One would have thought that in a world of die-hard lethal weapon, that this wouldn't work, but it does work. Why does it work?
Well, I think that people are a bit fed up with violence. I think that it's a curious thing that the entertainment industry feeds us a diet of constant violence and conflict, and in a sense social pathology. And I think that most people don't really like that. I mean, they are entertained by it, but in fact it doesn't reflect day-to-day life. Most of us lead very straightforward lives in which we aren't every day involved in a car chase, or most of us aren't. And I think therefore that we're ready for books which reflect that rather more peaceful, uneventful sort of life. And so my books have many scenes in which the characters sit around drinking tea, which is fine, and people feel quite relieved by that.
Well, it works. I mean, unimpeachably true. It works.
Well, thank you.
Something that I was curious about, and this is a lot of times one asks questions and knows the answer in advance, but this confused me. Her title,
yes.
MMA,
yes.
is pronounced how?
It's pronounced Ma. The double M accentuates the M sound in Setswana. I can't really do it terribly well. It's a sort of Ma. But in fact, I just call her Ma. Maramotswe.
I thought for a while, you know how when you read, you hear it in your head.
Yes.
For a while, I was calling her Emma, and then I was calling her Mama.
Well,
either one, right?
You were heading in the right direction. It's a sort of Ma. So you were heading in the right direction, but simplicity, I think, would indicate Ma.
A kind of Botswanan cozy, then.
Well, you could call it that, yes.
But there are other series of books I have really enjoyed. My favorite character is Bertie, of course.
Bertie.
I love Bertie.
Oh, he's a great wee boy, Bertie.
But the Scotland Street, now the genesis of that is also, in a sense, known. You were in California.
I was in California, and Amy Tan, the novelist, has been very kind to me. And she said, when you come to San Francisco, we'll have a party. And when I duly arrived in San Francisco, Amy said, well, we'll have a party, and went along. And there were all these literary types at this party, and including Armistead Maupin, the author of Tales of the City, which of course was run as a serial novel in the San Francisco Chronicle. And I had a conversation with him, and when I got back to Scotland, one of the papers said, would I write an article about my trip to San Francisco? And I duly did. And I mentioned this conversation with Armistead Maupin, and then I unwisely said, what a pity it is that newspapers don't have serial novels anymore. And I was then invited to lunch by the editor of The Scotsman, who gave me a very generous lunch and said, you're on. And I very unwisely said, that's fine, no problem. And so I started writing a serial novel, though I was committed to writing a serial novel with absolutely no idea of what it would be about. But the characters just seemed to walk onto the pages. And included in these characters was this little boy, 6-year-old boy, with a tremendously pushy mother, Bertie. And he's become very popular. People sympathize with Bertie.
Oh, of course, yes. Well, it's a nice cast altogether. Bruce is Bruce and kind of feckless and
yes, narcissist.
Absolutely. But there's a nice collection. What is your responsibility? How often does it appear? Daily?
It appears daily for 6 months of the year, and then I have 6 months off. And every day there's a chapter of 1,100 words in the Scotsman newspaper, and then at the end of the 6 months it's published in book form. So it is a daily commitment. I like to have quite a number written in advance.
I'll bet.
Yes, because it's living dangerously if you don't. But towards the end, I'm probably only about 3 episodes ahead of myself, and the literary editor of The Scotsman gets really quite anxious at that point. And indeed, earlier this year in February, my wife and I were on the Queen Mary II going round Cape Horn at the bottom of South America, and I was writing episodes and sending them back to The Scotsman, back to headquarters by email, and the ship got out of email contact as we rounded the Horn. For some reason it was difficult to make contact, and so they were very worried, and I was just 1 day ahead. But fortunately, the episodes got through. But that's as close to the wire as I've got.
Well, that is very much a 21st century version of Dickens scribbling away with the boy at his elbow.
Yes. Well, I think that people forget just how common it was to write serial novels. In that Dickens, as you say, did it, and the public waited for the latest installment, although they were published in fairly large chunks. But Tolstoy did it, and Flaubert did it. Madame Bovary was published on a serial basis in the newspapers, and almost landed Flaubert in prison because it was thought to be a bit scandalous. I haven't yet been threatened with imprisonment. Conditions are different, and I don't think my novels are scandalous anyway. But it was a very common thing to do, and I think that people are coming back to it. In that, since Scotland Street was published, the Edmonton Journal in Canada has done one. The man who wrote that said that I was inspired by Maupassant, and I inspired him.
Good.
So it's catching. It's catching. You should have one here in Alabama. Get one of your writers to start a serial novel.
We have done a serial novel in the paper with many hands.
Right.
But it had to be weekly.
Right, and with different
Yes,
people writing
each chapter.
Well, that's interesting.
Yes,
Yes,
that's fun too.
Yes, well, there'd be a lot of fun in that.
Your new novel, the one that is the subject of your travels at the moment, is an Isabel Dalhousie novel.
Yes.
Now you've made her an interesting creature. She is independently wealthy.
Yes.
She lives in...
She's not tremendously wealthy, but she's got enough to get by.
And she's generous as well.
And she's generous, yes.
And she lives in Edinburgh in a nice neighborhood, not unlike your own.
Yes, perhaps even in our house, we don't know.
And she edits a journal of ethics.
Applied ethics.
Applied ethics.
Yes, she's a moral philosopher. Yeah.
She is... Two things that particular about Isabel. One, of course, since this is Alabama Public Television,
yes.
You have given her Alabama roots.
Well, on her mother's side,
yes.
That's right. Isabel's father was a Scotsman. He was a Scottish lawyer who lived in Edinburgh, but he had done graduate study in the United States, and he'd met her mother, and her mother's family came from Mobile. And
why?
Well, because I like Mobile, and I was invited to go to Mobile, and in my particular situation, I go all over the place and go to many places, and every so often I go somewhere where I think this is just a really nice place. It doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen. And when I first went to Mobile, I thought, what an intriguing and nice place. And I also had the great good fortune of falling amongst nice people, in that the people who'd invited me there were really utterly charming, wonderful people, and everybody I seemed to meet in Mobile was very friendly. Now, it's possible that there are some unfriendly people in Mobile, but they were obviously out of town when I was there. And so I made a number of friends. And I asked my publishers to send me back. And so I went back to Mobile again, and I hope to go back. I thought that it was a very charming place. And the architecture, there's such lovely architecture, there's gorgeous avenues with their live oaks making a canopy for the road. Just marvelous. So I made Isabel. I gave her some mobile routes.
And you even promoted the Mobilians' favorite idea, which is that Mardi Gras was theirs and not New Orleans.
I was very careful to make that point because I gather that certain upstarts elsewhere claim Mardi Gras and that it really comes from Alabama. So I've made that known to a much wider public now.
I think so. This is, in a sense, this is a novel in which not much happens, and yet there are issues that need to be dealt with. And one of them is Isabel is Isabel 42?
Early 40s, yeah.
And she falls in love with a man how much younger?
Will 14 years younger.
14 years younger.
Yeah, he's late 20s. Yeah.
Well, and she is an ethicist,
yes.
Applied ethics.
Yes.
Anything wrong with that?
Well, I don't think so. I don't think there's anything wrong in principle with that, in that I think people are always falling in love with all sorts of people, and often they fall in love with thoroughly unsuitable people. In fact, that's not an uncommon story at all. I suppose that we are probably culturally more attuned to an age difference the other way around, in that we're more accustomed, or I suppose we're less surprised by an age difference with an older man and a younger woman. Seems to be quite a common pattern, or more common pattern. But there's no reason why it shouldn't be the other way around. In fact, I think many women would say that what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander, and therefore these relationships are perfectly all right. However, there are always difficulties, I think, there can be difficulties in those circumstances where there is a considerable age difference. It can be difficult sometimes, and I suppose if you look at it from the point of view of Isabel, here she is with a younger man who's got perhaps may have different career possibilities ahead of him, etc., when she may not be thinking of moving, and so on. So there we are. But
yes. I was delighted, and when I came to that place where they had connected and they had decided that they cared for each other.
Yes.
I thought, there are going to be thousands of his women readers who are going to write to him and say, "Oh yes."
Well, yes. You see, I was coming under pressure after Volume 2, when she was denying herself, in a sense, and trying to put her feelings to the side. I came under pressure from various readers who said, "You must let Isabel really get closer to this young man." And I had resisted that, but there comes a point at which you just have to give in.
You're very responsive to readers. I see that a lot. That you enjoy your fan mail. You enjoy what we horribly call feedback.
Yeah,
and so on.
Well, I do. I think that it's a marvelous aspect of being an author, that you can engage in a prolonged conversation with, I suppose, with many millions of people, if one's lucky, and that's a great privilege. And I consider it a great privilege to be able to also to meet readers, which I do constantly when I'm on book tours and doing events and whatnot. And it's very, very nice. It's wonderful.
And you put them into the books sometimes.
I do put real people into the books. My books my novels have real characters. This latest one, the Right Attitude to Reign, the latest Isabel Dalhousie one, has old friends of mine from Dallas, Joe and Mimi McKnight. And I have made Mimi, who's a real person living in Dallas, the cousin of this fictional character, Isabel Dalhousie, with her agreement, of course. And they've been very happy to go into the books as characters.
That fire at the end of the novel, the fire that occurs, arson?
I don't know.
Don't know?
I just don't know. No,
I knew
think-
you were going to say that. I was absolutely certain.
Well, you mustn't assume that authors tie up all the loose ends.
No.
As in life, certain things might not be known.
Well, you've been interviewed on television a number of times over the last 10 years.
Yes.
So far, I haven't seen anything in your books about you being interviewed on television.
No. Well, I tend not to write. I tend not to write about myself. I certainly wouldn't put myself as a character in the books.
How does your specialty as a professor of law was ethics and bioethics, as well obviously as legal education?
Yes.
How does that work? I, of course, since I knew that as I went into reading the novels, I could see, here's a Good Samaritan issue, or here is a
Yes.
omission versus commission
Yes.
issue.
Yes.
That must be fun for you, but also an interesting kind of, you have to keep a light touch.
Yes, I think these issues of these ethical issues, these ethical quandaries, dilemmas that people find themselves in, are very interesting indeed. And indeed, in our day-to-day life, we have all sorts of interesting moral problems to contend with. How we treat our friends, issues of omission and commission, for example, as you've said. And these are fascinating, but of course one doesn't want to get too heavy in discussing them, because obviously people don't like to be preached at, and they don't like you to become too didactic. They prefer you to deal with it in a light way. So I think a light touch is required.
But it was cunning of you to make her an editor of
Well,
a journal
indeed.
in which there would be manuscript submissions that she could then consider.
Indeed, you've spotted the ploy.
Well,
It's more obvious than we might imagine.
thank you very much. I appreciate this. I know, in your case especially, just what a fantastically rushed schedule you have. This has been a lot of fun and very generous of you.
It's been a complete pleasure for me. Thank you very much for the invitation.